You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production in association with City News.
This is a case of the right person in the right place at, well, it's hard to call this the right time, but it doesn't hurt that Chrystia Freeland is Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance right now.
And to our Russian counterparts, who are today struggling vainly to prop up a ruble in freefall, let me say, we warned you.
39 countries, including the UK, Canada, and the Netherlands, voted to refer Putin's actions to the International Criminal Court.
In light of Russia's reckless and dangerous military strike, we're imposing further severe sanctions.
Freeland has deep ties to Ukraine. She is respected around the world for her tough stance on Russia, and as we have seen over the past couple of weeks, she has been one of the politicians on the world stage pushing hardest for sanctions that will make Russian President Vladimir Putin feel real economic pain over his invasion. So what is Minister Freeland's long history with Ukraine? Is it an asset in this case or an anchor? Does that depend on who you ask? How did she lead the way to get countries around the world on board with these sanctions? And is this actually a real Canadian foreign policy? Because we haven't had one of those in quite a while. I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Justin Ling is a freelance investigative journalist who covers just about everything from misinformation and conspiracy theories to extremism, policing, and national security. Hi, Justin.
Hey, Jordan. How's it going?
It's going all right. It's been an interesting couple of weeks here.
Yeah, no kidding.
Why don't we start today? Because I think a lot of Canadians have been hearing a ton about our role in sanctions against Russia. Who has been leading that push in the government?
I think when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, there's been a general consensus inside the Trudeau government. I don't think you've seen a ton of people who are offside who think that we ought to forge a sort of alternate path when it comes to Russia. The only figure in this government that I can point to that was sort of the belief that we should be a little softer on these issues was Stéphane Dion, our former foreign affairs minister, who was sort of unceremoniously kicked to the curb a few years back and replaced with Chrystia Freeland. And since then, I think the focus has been very much in line with what Minister Freeland believes, which is that Russia is ultimately an illiberal force in world affairs, that it is a real threat to the international order we've built, and that fundamentally it's a threat to European and North American security. And you've seen that ethos sort of carry over and sort of inform how the Trudeau government operates. And I think it's fair to say that Chrystia Freeland is herself one of the most influential figures when it comes to Canada's position, both on world affairs, but specifically when it comes to Ukraine and Russia.
Well, and this is where I'm fascinated by, I guess, the coincidence of the timing. Can you tell me more about Chrystia Freeland specifically and her background as it relates to Ukraine? Because this is deep.
Yeah. So Freeland herself is Ukrainian. I mean, she's, I think, second generation Ukrainian, has been a kind of a vocal proponent for the Ukrainian cause, for a sort of liberal Ukrainian democracy for quite some time. Her mother actually had a hand in helping draft the Ukrainian constitution. Freeland herself speaks Russian, Ukrainian, and English and French, of course. She has, during her career as a journalist, worked as the bureau chief in Moscow. She has been incredibly influential over the years in terms of the state of affairs in Russia and Ukraine. As bureau chief, she worked closely with Bill Browder, a noted critic of the Putin regime and a sort of a scourge to oligarchs everywhere. Chrystia Freeland helped publish some of his research into some shady dealings in the Russian oil and gas sector. And beyond that, Freeland has been a pretty avid champion for the more democratic, Western-leaning element inside Ukraine. So her influence here looms pretty large. She herself is actually banned from going to Russia. She was on the list of members of parliament who were sanctioned by Moscow after the tit-for-tat retaliation following the 2014 invasion of Donetsk and Crimea. So, Freeland is a pretty prominent voice when it comes to everything Ukraine, Russia. And she's also been a major target of Russian partly disinformation, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. The Russians have honed in aggressively on her own family history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the fact that Russia has spent so much time and energy trying to spear her is an indication of just, how much they view her as a major figure in the Western response to Russian aggression.
And we'll come back and talk more about Freeland and some of the conspiracy theories floating around about her. But first, I wanted to get a picture of, what Canada is doing and what's happening against Russia in general. So first, maybe just how close are Canada and Ukraine in general? How tight is this relationship beyond Chrystia Freeland?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that there is a long-standing deep relationship between the two countries. Canada has the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world after Russia. It has a significant number of folks who speak, understand Ukrainian. We have academic departments that focus on Ukrainian affairs, Ukrainian studies, Ukrainian literature. There is really significant travel between the two countries. Canada has a sort of a unique spot in that it's not European, but has these really, really deep roots in the country. And I think it has informed how Ottawa has approached things happening in Ukraine in recent years. Prior to the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, Ukraine was sort of a difficult case. You had a quite corrupt government that wasn't terribly interested in managing its relations with the rest of Europe or North America, at least not to the same degree that it does now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think fundamentally, there wasn't much for Canada to do there. I mean, Ukraine was trying to figure out how to leverage its relationship with Moscow to become a major oil and gas supplier for Europe, and Canada didn't really fit into that equation. After the revolution, after you saw former President Yanukovych thrown out of office and replaced with a democratically elected government led by Petro Poroshenko, you saw more of a willingness to work with Western powers to manage their economy, to root out some of that corruption, to figure out how to liberalize and democratize. And Canada stepped up in a relatively major way. I mean, I think I'm somebody who counts myself as incredibly critical and skeptical of how the Canadian government has managed international affairs in recent years. But Ukraine is a bright spot. Ukraine is a spot where Canada both put up money, support, military assets, personnel, expertise in order to try and modernize their military, modernize their economy, sort of decouple themselves from the Russian regime and figure out how to kind of get itself on a path to potentially even EU membership. And all things told, this is pretty significant. Canada has become one of the most kind of integral partners to Ukraine, which is no small feat.
So can you describe then what happened once Russia invaded from Canada's perspective, I guess, in terms of the sanctions that have been put in place, and probably not all of those in detail because there are a million of them by now, but how Canada kind of pushed to ramp those up and where they got to?
Yeah, so it's worth going back just for a second to 2014, when the West tried to place consequences on Russia for seizing Crimea and Donetsk. It did so in a very kind of hesitant way. I don't think the West had entirely grappled with what it meant to discourage this sort of aggressive behavior, right? There was an effort to start sanctioning corrupt officials. There was an effort to sanction folks who supported Putin directly, including members of his cabinet, members of the Duma, the legislature in Russia. But I don't think the EU the US and Canada were quite on the same page in terms of how to coordinate that response in such a way that would actually discourage what Russia was doing. So, these sanctions definitely hurt the Putin government. It cost them billions of dollars and absolutely shaved off any GDP growth that Russia should have been experiencing otherwise. But it didn't manage to sort of discourage Putin from leveraging the ill-gotten gains he sees, right? So Putin managed to win a significant oil and gas reserve in the Black Sea, around Crimea, in Donetsk. And fundamentally, it meant that Putin made money off of this in many ways. He actually probably helped the long-term economic viability of the Russian state by this invasion, despite those sanctions. When he started readying for the most recent invasion late last year, I think he firmly believed that the same thing would happen, that the EU, the US, and Canada would not be able to get on the same page to slap sanctions on him, to actually form and express consequences for what he had done, or at the very least that he'd be able to take Kiev before any sort of major economic sanctions package would be put together. And fundamentally, in almost a shocking way, he was wrong on every single front. Canada, in particular, started the campaign to sanction the Russian central bank. Now, this was considered almost impossible to get done. This was touted a few times in the days leading up to the invasion. But frankly, there was a general incredulity over the idea that Western states would manage to sanction the central bank and cut off Russia from its foreign currency reserves.
Why is that?
Because fundamentally, it would cost the world a significant amount of money. Cutting off Russia from its foreign currency reserves, which would probably lead to a tit-for-tat measure from Moscow, and indeed it did, would mean that rubles the states are holding could become essentially worthless or at least unusable. It also meant that significant amounts of assets that Russia had abroad would be essentially frozen, and that would have a significant chilling effect on all sorts of trading for the G7 essentially. And it came with a broader package as well. Sanctions, of course, on many banks that do business in the West, as well as cutting off many Russian institutions from the SWIFT payment system.
Just quickly, for those who don't know, what is SWIFT?
So SWIFT is actually a messaging platform that manages a lot of exchanges between banks worldwide. It's basically a common language that banks can use to facilitate money transfers, for example, and many other sort of day-to-day financial transactions. And it is far and away probably the most important piece of infrastructure to enable international trading and finance. And tens of thousands of banks are on this. To not be part of the SWIFT club is to not be speaking the language of most major financial institutions. Now, Canada helped either spearhead those initiatives or championing them when the UK put them forward. And all told, this has a huge effect on many major economies, particularly in Europe, less so Canada, but nevertheless, this is why Putin really did not expect to see this level of kind of coordination from the West, because it meant countries like Italy, Germany, France were going to forego billions of dollars in trade and freeze billions of dollars in assets that would have blowback on their own economies. And frankly, I've been gobsmacked that there was an ability to get all of these governments on side to herd cats, essentially, and to get them on the same page to launch these sanctions. And not only that, they did it in the course of a week. Now, there's lots to be said about whether or not these sanctions should have been put in place before the invasion happened in order to dissuade this unprecedented invasion. But nevertheless, the fact that it was done is frankly incredible.
Well, that was my next question about the timing of them is, do we know yet, or when will we know if they're having an impact in Russia that would push Putin towards de-escalation?
So there's going to be short-term consequences, medium-term consequences, and long-term consequences. The short-term, you're already seeing it. Oligarchs close to the Putin regime, oligarchs that have supported Putin and benefited from his state-level corruption, have seen their yachts seized throughout Europe. They've seen assets they own abroad taken by Western governments, and you may even see some of those assets liquidated. You're seeing the West seize these ill-gotten gains and actually kind of hit these oligarchs on the bottom line, which is massive. I can't stress enough that the Putin regime, it has a symbiotic relationship with the corrupt upper classes. These oligarchs support the Putin regime financially, politically. They manage the media, they manage his propaganda, they manage the financing of his state. But on the flip side, he needs them.
Right.
Without this elite class to manage his popularity, to keep his state running, he would not be in power today. So weakening support for him and for this nationalist invasion by the oligarch class is really, really significant. Now, that is the short-term consequence. That is probably manageable. But as you go into the future, in the medium long term, cutting the Russian government off SWIFT, making it nearly impossible to have foreign currency reserves to sort of scaffold up the ruble, that is going to have incredibly damaging consequences on the Russian economy. It's going to essentially decouple the Russian regime from the rest of the world, with some exceptions. And in so doing, that makes it much harder to get foreign direct investment. That makes it much harder for him to do international collaborations or to launch oil and gas projects in other countries. It's going to make it harder and harder for him to sell his energy as countries try to unplug from the Russian gas supply. And in the long term, it's going to mean, and this is really the only bright spot for him, it's going to mean he needs to plug in more intently to the Chinese economy. There's a huge benefit potentially for Russia there, especially as China sees itself more isolated from the rest of the world. You could sort of see an illiberal bloc that is sort of has two poles in Russia and China, and is supported by other rogue regimes and countries that need more direct investment. So everything from North Korea to many states in Central Africa to many countries in the Caucasus that are already in the Russian sphere of influence, and you could see sort of a two economy world. One of Western liberal democracies and one of more repressive, nationalist, authoritarian regimes led by Russia and China. Now, that's a huge opportunity for Russia, but it also comes with huge pitfalls. It would essentially mean that Russia is, second banana to China in this new world order, and it would potentially become just sort of a energy supplier to a high-tech Chinese regime. So there's upsides and downsides to this, but it's all to say that the decisions made over the last week have fundamentally set a course for a very different world economic order over the next 10 years.
So that push for sanctions led by Canada, does it also give tacit permission, I guess is the word I'm looking for the rest of the West to weigh in? And I'm thinking here about companies. We've seen Visa and MasterCard now pull out of Russia. I know Netflix and many, many other digital companies have stopped doing business in Russia. Is that sort of encouraged by the level of sanctions that, as you say, people just didn't expect?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of this was provoked by two things. One, how brutal and aggressive the invasion was. I think there was real speculation that whatever Putin did, it would be on a much smaller scale than what we've seen. There was talk of him trying to seize large portions of the east, of maybe trying to kind of form a land border, a land bridge between Donetsk and Crimea and sort of stop there. I think if he had done that, you would not see the sort of universal response that you've seen here. The fact that he made a go for Kiev, the fact that you see him shelling civilian positions throughout the country, the fact that you're seeing airstrikes on civilian targets, I think it has galvanized the world in a really significant way that I don't think anyone saw coming. So, that's part one. Part two, the resistance of the Ukrainian people is hard not to be inspired by, right? The fact that everyday people have stood up, some nonviolently, some arming themselves, to oppose this invasion. The fact that you've seen these incredible successes, everything from Ukrainian farmers, seizing tanks that were stuck in the mud, to amateur drone operators volunteering to try and thwart Russian airstrikes, to everyday folks and politicians picking up Kalashnikovs to go patrol the streets and defend against this unbelievable war of aggression. I think it is really hard not to feel inspired and supportive of the Ukrainian people. And I think that the governments have almost extraordinarily gotten on the same page to decry this incredible act of aggression. I think it absolutely has spurred private companies, and some, I think, altruistically, some because they realize there's a great marketing opportunity. Either way, I think it's absolutely getting a lot of those private enterprises on board and pushing them to do something. And I do not believe Russia imagined this. I don't think he imagined the West speaking with one voice. I don't think he imagined everyday people around the world, seeing what's going on and being so attuned to the violence that's happening. And I don't think he anticipated just how resilient the Ukrainian people would be and just how aggressively they reject the idea that Russia gets to decide their future instead of them themselves.
As we end here, I want to bring it back to Canada and to Chrystia Freeland, just because, as you say, she's one of the catalysts for United West in terms of sanctions. Given her history with Ukraine and, the misinformation tactics that you mentioned from Russia, how are they attempting to use that against her, and what kind of stuff, because I know you cover this, are we seeing filter out there on the internet about her past ties to Ukraine?
It's quite funny because I think we give Russia an awful lot of credit for its propaganda and disinformation efforts. And there's no doubt that they do it a lot. And there's no doubt that they try really hard. But the simple reality is they're not as good as they think they are. I used to go get beers with an official in the Russian embassy. He was later booted out of the country for being an intelligence asset. But we used to go get beers, and he tried really hard to convince me that the fact that her great-grandfather was the editor of a paper that operated during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, the fact that he worked there was evidence that Chrystia Freeland herself is some sort of Nazi sympathizer. He tried repeatedly to sort of hand me documents that would prove that Canada was supporting some fascist tendencies in Ukraine, and I had to laugh at him. And I said, this is not going to convince anybody. Nobody buys this. And nevertheless, he kept pushing it, and it is still a thread out there. Although I think it has ultimately failed to convince many people of Chrystia Freeland's supposed sympathies for Nazism. But they do this a lot. More recently, you've seen an effort by the Russian regime to push the idea that maybe this invasion is all about destroying biological laboratories that are hidden throughout Ukraine that America is using to create bioweapons, which of course is absolutely ludicrous. And you have to imagine probably taking a page out of George W. Bush's excuse for invading Iraq in 2003. But nevertheless, you see these repeated efforts to, I think, try and undermine Western support for Ukraine. That it fundamentally comes from a place of thinking we're idiots. I think Russia thinks we're quite stupid. And I think a lot of their propaganda belies that kind of low estimation of our intelligence. And I think they're continuing to double down on it. And I think, again, it shows just how little Russia expected the response.
Right.
I think it shows just how optimistic they were that this invasion would go somewhat differently. And I think as time goes on, it's only going to become more and more apparent just how much Russia, did not have a good reason for this, just how much they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes and convince us that this is not a war of aggression, that this is not a full-scale invasion, that this is something quite different. And it's not working. And I think as the sort of gleam comes off Putin's mystique, I think you'll see his position become more and more untenable. Will that be enough to unseat him? I don't know, but I think it'll be interesting to watch.
Justin, thank you for this. I want to ask you one quick question before you go, because It's kind of a cynical and political one, but just because the timing is so apt. What do you think this could mean for Freeland's political future? You know, if I go back 6 months to after the last election, she was already kind of seen as a liberal leader in waiting and a successor to Trudeau. Does this help or hurt her? Does this give her momentum? What do you think?
I don't know. I frankly don't know, and I always, I kind of bristle at the idea that we have to ascribe domestic political consequences to a truly horrifying international disaster. But let me say this: her political future, I think, is a big question mark. I've certainly talked to people who do not think she intends on running, that she is actually happy where she is. And I think there's probably some truth to that. I mean, being prime minister means being a retail politician to a large degree. It means a lot of politicking. It means a lot of nonsense.
Right.
And looking at Freeland now, I think this is where she thrives, being not quite out front, somewhere in the back of the pack a little bit, but really, doing the hard work, managing crises, and really being kind of the backbone of the government. I think that's something she prefers a little more. And I will say, this government in particular has not had a coherent foreign policy in the 7 years it's been in power. Mm-hmm. It has really wrung its hands until they bled in many respects on major issues abroad. It has been, I think, too quiet on other humanitarian disasters from Yemen to Venezuela to many other places. I don't think Canada has led any initiatives. I don't think it has been a critical player in international affairs, with the exception of what's happening right now. And I think perhaps that is Freeland's influence. Perhaps it's just a sign that this government does better in a crisis than it does in regular times. But nevertheless, I have to imagine that Freeland, doesn't necessarily want to give up a good thing. I think Trudeau, intends on running again. I think she enjoys being, the deputy prime minister, and I don't anticipate anyone's going to use the current crisis to change that.
Thanks, Justin. I had to ask.
Yeah, of course.
That was Justin Ling, and that was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can find us anytime on Twitter at TheBigStoryFPN. And of course, you can write to us and leave us an email and let us know what you think. The address is TheBigStoryPodcast, that's all one word, at rci.rogers.com. The Big Story can be found wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, doesn't matter, wherever. Leave a rating, leave a review, tell your friends. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.